Russia, long presented to the world as an unshakable superpower, now feels that a massive economic and political catastrophe is drawing dangerously close. This is not just media exaggeration. The International Monetary Fund, in its World Economic Outlook report of April 2024, revealed that the Russian economy grew by only 0.9%, while the global average reached 3.1%. This gap shows that Vladimir Putin's country is moving against the tide of the world economy, even after pouring billions of dollars into its war machine. How can a nation that spends so heavily on weapons fail to generate growth for its own people? The answers coming from the Kremlin bring no reassurance. Instead of discussing economic solutions, Putin and Sergei Lavrov repeat nuclear threats against the West, warning that any deployment of foreign troops to Ukraine would be considered a legitimate target for destruction. But is the West truly underestimating Moscow, or has Russia deceived itself? In February 2022, the Kremlin promised to seize Kyiv in just 3 days. More than 3 years have now passed, and Russian forces have not even come close to the Ukrainian capital. Meanwhile, internal fragility is becoming increasingly evident. The World Bank, in its Global Economic Prospects report of June 2024, projected that Russia's gross domestic product will remain virtually stagnant until 2026, with growth rates hovering near zero. This means that even if the war drags on, the country will have no economic margin to sustain its military effort without imposing even greater sacrifices on its own population. What good are nuclear threats to the world if the domestic economy is already begging for relief? This is the central contradiction. A government that presents itself as a global power but weakens with every official statistic released. Perhaps Moscow's speeches are not demonstrations of strength, but desperate cries from a regime that feels collapse drawing near. And if the economy is already showing such obvious signs of exhaustion, one deeply uncomfortable question remains. How do ordinary citizens survive in the Russian-occupied cities where millions lack even access to clean drinking water? The forgotten people. In Donetsk, one of the main cities under Russian occupation, water supply was cut off on September 10, 2024. Since then, hundreds of thousands of residents have struggled to survive in precarious conditions, relying on improvised wells and long walks just to secure a few liters of water. According to a humanitarian report by the United Nations published in September 2024, more than 1.5 million people in the Donbass region have already faced chronic water shortages since the beginning of the war. This reality exposes the contradiction between the official discourse of liberation and the inability to provide basic services to civilian populations. While the water infrastructure collapses, Russia's public budget continues to be drained by war. The World Bank revealed in June 2024, in its Global Economic Prospects report, that the Kremlin allocated more than $130 billion in 2023 alone to finance military operations. That amount would have been enough to modernize the entire water and sanitation system of eastern Ukraine, but it was instead burned away on missiles and drones. The dilemma is inevitable. How can a nuclear power take pride in its arsenal while failing to provide clean water to the territories it controls? Personal stories confirm the tragedy. The International Red Cross reported in August 2024 that children in Donetsk are already showing signs of malnutrition and diseases linked to the lack of sanitation. Accounts of families forced to ration every cup of water contrast with state propaganda that continues to showcase tanks and military parades. This contradiction reveals that the war is not only a territorial dispute, but also a project that disregards human dignity. This is the true face of collapse. Billions channeled into sustaining military power while citizens live in near-medieval conditions. If Moscow cannot even care for the areas it occupies, how much longer can it sustain a war that has dragged on for more than 3 years? The answer may be closer than it appears. If you believe this kind of information should not be silenced, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This simple action is what allows us to continue bringing data, stories, and analysis that expose the side governments would rather hide. Because if water is already missing in Donetsk, what else is the Kremlin willing to sacrifice? Putin's speech. At the economic summit held in Russia's Far East in September 2024, President Vladimir Putin was expected to speak about investment, growth, and development prospects. Instead, his speech was dominated by threats against the West. Putin declared that any deployment of foreign troops to Ukraine would turn those soldiers into legitimate targets for destruction. The contrast could not be clearer. At an event dedicated to the economy, the Russian leader avoided addressing financial matters, perhaps because the numbers no longer work in his favor. In August 2024, the Central Bank of Russia officially admitted that the country had entered a technical recession, with GDP stagnating near zero after consecutive declines in investment and production. The contradiction became even sharper when journalists asked why troops from North Korea could be welcomed into Russia without issue, while Ukraine was supposedly denied the right to seek support from its allies. In July 2024, the BBC reported on this embarrassing moment when the Kremlin's spokesperson merely repeated that foreign forces near Russia's borders represented a real danger. But what danger is that when Russia itself is importing foreign soldiers to fight on its territory? The Kremlin's selective logic reveals a fragility far greater than its nuclear threats suggest. While Putin tries to mask the crisis with military rhetoric, the economic numbers keep deteriorating. The International Monetary Fund projected in October 2024 that Russia's economy would grow by only 0.7% in 2025, one of the worst rates among major economies. This stagnation proves that every missile fired at Ukraine carries a cost that boomerangs back against the Russian people themselves. How can a long war be sustained when the economic engine is already stalling? This is the image that crystallizes. A president who should be speaking about development at an economic summit, but who hides behind threats of destruction. And the question that echoes is simple. How long will aggressive rhetoric be enough to conceal the silent bankruptcy unfolding at the heart of the Russian economy? The weight of the economy. Right at the start of this section, one figure dismantles any narrative of strength. In September 2024, the Central Bank of Russia reported that annual inflation had once again surpassed the 8% mark, despite successive interest rate hikes aimed at controlling prices. This is a clear signal that Russian monetary policy is no longer capable of containing the effects of war. Added to this is the capital flight, which, according to the International Monetary Fund, exceeded $80 billion in 2023 alone, a figure that explains why Vladimir Putin preferred to talk about military threats rather than economics at his last summit. Stagnation is not just a pessimistic forecast. It is a reality already acknowledged by Russia's own institutions. The state-owned Sberbank admitted in an August 2024 report that GDP growth had come to a halt and that the economy had officially entered a technical recession. This term, often softened in economic language, means the country is no longer generating enough wealth to expand jobs, wages, and investment. Every ruble spent on war translates into fewer resources on the tables of ordinary citizens. The paradox is that Russia tries to sell the world an image of heroic resistance, while internally it lives under the weight of a war machine consuming its own reserves. According to data from the International Energy Agency published in July 2024, Russia's oil export revenues dropped by around 30% compared to 2022, pressured by sanctions and forced discounts in sales to Asia. That means fewer foreign currencies flowing into the country, at the same time that military expenditures continue to rise. How long can such an equation last without breaking? Every time the Kremlin announces a new strike on Ukraine, the economic cost is invisible to outsiders but devastating for those inside Russia. Inflation erodes wages, imported goods vanish from store shelves, foreign companies abandon the Russian market, and yet Moscow insists on maintaining the course of war. The inevitable question lingers. Can Russia really hide for much longer the fact that its economy is already imploding from within? The military escalation. On the night of August 27, 2024, Ukraine endured the second-largest Russian attack since the start of the war. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, more than 800 drones, 9 Iskander cruise missiles, and 4 ballistic missiles of the same model were launched. The defense system managed to intercept most of them, but 50 drones and 9 missiles broke through. The result? 3 deaths, including a 6-year-old child, along with dozens of injuries. These figures, confirmed by Reuters in its August 28, 2024 report, highlight how Russia continues to prioritize strikes on urban centers, fully aware that most of the victims will be civilians. Moscow's justification is a familiar refrain. Everyone is an enemy. Everyone is part of NATO. But how can the death of a child be justified under the argument of national security? This is the paradox that reveals the emptiness of the official discourse. The Kremlin claims to be fighting foreign soldiers, yet in practice it directs bombs at homes, hospitals, and schools. The United Nations Human Rights Office has recorded more than 10,000 civilian deaths since February 2022, a number that continues to rise with each new attack. For the outside world, these might look like just another set of statistics. But inside Ukraine, every siren is a reminder of the fragility of daily life. Families rush into underground shelters. The elderly endure nights without electricity. Children learn to distinguish the sounds of drones from those of missiles. How can one maintain any semblance of normal life in such a reality? And the more disturbing question, how far does Moscow intend to escalate if even massive assaults bring no tangible military gains? With every new strike, the political cost for Russia also grows. The European Union announced in September 2024 that it was considering new energy sanctions, precisely as a response to the surge in attacks on civilians. The war, which Moscow once promised would end in a matter of days, has now dragged on for more than 3 years, pushing the country into deeper isolation. The question is, if brute force cannot deliver strategic victories, what will be the Kremlin's next move? The pressure of sanctions. What if I told you that Russia's greatest threat does not come from tanks or missiles, but from the silent collapse triggered by international sanctions? In September 2024, the International Monetary Fund projected that if the United States and the European Union move forward with secondary sanctions, Russia could lose up to 10% of its annual energy export revenues. This forecast, published in the World Economic Outlook update, reinforces the idea that the Kremlin depends almost entirely on oil and gas to finance its war machine. Energy is Vladimir Putin's weapon, and it is precisely this weapon that the West is trying to take away. The strategy goes beyond punishing Moscow directly. The goal is also to target the countries that still keep its exports alive. In August 2024, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent declared that India, China, Turkey, and Brazil could themselves face secondary sanctions if they continued purchasing Russian oil. This shift represents an economic escalation. It is no longer just about cutting Russia's direct flows, but about choking off the alternative routes that keep money circulating in the Kremlin. The question is, how many of these countries will be willing to risk their global trade ties in order to support Moscow? The effects are already visible in the numbers. According to the International Energy Agency, published in July 2024, Russia's oil revenue fell by around 30% compared to the 2022 peak, a direct result of sanctions and forced discounts to sell to Asia. At the same time, the ruble has lost more than 40% of its value against the dollar since February 2022, eroding domestic purchasing power. It is a tightening vice that grows harsher with each passing month. Putin's narrative insists on portraying Russia as resilient, but reality shows that every additional sanction translates into more pressure on an already battered economy. How long can the Kremlin sustain its discourse of strength when the very numbers reveal weakness? And if secondary sanctions are applied jointly by the United States and the European Union, will Russia have the capacity to keep funding its war? The deadlock of peace. At the heart of this conflict lies a central question. Is it possible to negotiate with a leader who has so often broken his own promises? In February 2022, just 2 days before the invasion, Vladimir Putin publicly declared that he had no intention of entering Ukraine. This statement, recorded by the Russian state agency TASS, was swiftly contradicted by the tanks that crossed the border. The pattern is not new. Back in 2014, the Kremlin affirmed that Crimea was Ukrainian territory, only to annex the peninsula months later. This track record explains why Volodymyr Zelensky rejected the proposal to negotiate in Moscow in September 2024, stating he could not go to the capital of terrorists while his people were being bombed daily. Ukraine's position is backed by the numbers. The United Nations Human Rights Office confirmed that since the beginning of the invasion, more than 10,000 civilians have been killed and over 20,000 injured. Each drone or missile strike reinforces the perception that Putin is not seeking a ceasefire, but Ukraine's total surrender. How can peace be negotiated with someone who turns hospitals and schools into strategic targets? Meanwhile, Western leaders push for harsher measures. In September 2024, the United States Senate debated a bill granting President Donald Trump the legal authority to sanction any country financing Russia's war machine. The logic is straightforward. Without money, there is no ammunition. Trump himself declared in an interview with Fox News that 3 things win a war: money, money, and money. The phrase resonates as a summary of the entire Western strategy, cutting off Moscow's financial lifelines until the Kremlin is forced to sit at the negotiating table. Against this backdrop, one conclusion is inevitable. This war will not be decided solely on the battlefield, but also in global markets, in energy exports, and through international sanctions. Russia still presents itself as a military power, but its own figures reveal that collapse may be closer than it admits. The question is whether that collapse will trigger real change. or an even more dangerous escalation. If you believe this debate must reach more people, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave your comment. Your support strengthens independent analysis and keeps alive the discussion about the future of global geopolitics. Thank you for staying with us until the end, and get ready, because the next video may bring answers that today seem impossible.